There is a conversation happening in diabetes clinics across America that almost never takes place. A patient sits down, A1C elevated, glucose readings climbing despite medication, and the physician leans forward and says the word that ends the discussion before it ever begins: fruit. Avoid fruit. Too much sugar. Stick to vegetables. And the patient leaves, believing that nature's most accessible, most ancient source of nutrition has somehow become their enemy. They stop eating the bowl of berries they loved. They push away the apple their grandmother handed them every afternoon. They accept that diabetes means subtraction, endless subtraction, of everything that once brought simple pleasure to a meal. What no physician in that conversation mentions is that this advice, delivered as settled fact, contradicts a substantial and growing body of peer-reviewed research showing that specific fruits, eaten in the right amounts, at the right times, in their whole form, do not raise blood sugar dangerously. They lower it. They improve insulin sensitivity. They reduce A1C over time. They protect the kidneys, the retinas, the cardiovascular system from exactly the damage that uncontrolled blood sugar causes. The research is not obscure. It is not fringe. It is published in journals that every endocrinologist in the country has access to. And it is almost never discussed in a 15-minute appointment where a prescription refill is the primary agenda. Today that changes. The 3 best fruits for diabetics over 60 will be examined, ranked from beneficial to genuinely extraordinary, with a full explanation of the biological mechanisms behind each one, the specific research supporting their use, the correct dosing and timing protocols that make the difference between a helpful addition and a glucose spike, and the real stories of people who discovered what their physicians never told them. By the end of this video, there will be a complete, actionable protocol that can be started at the next meal. If this is the kind of information that should have come from a doctor years ago, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. Because the community being built here exists for one purpose: to hand seniors the truth that the medical system has decided is too inconvenient, too unprofitable, and too simple to discuss. Before revealing the 3 fruits, it is worth understanding exactly why most diabetes dietary advice about fruit is wrong, or more precisely, why it is dangerously incomplete. The standard concern about fruit centers on fructose, the naturally occurring sugar found in most fruit. In isolated form, consumed in excess, as in high fructose corn syrup in processed food, fructose does cause metabolic harm. It bypasses the normal insulin signaling pathway, goes directly to the liver, and when consumed in large quantities, can contribute to insulin resistance and fatty liver disease. This much is true, but whole fruit is not isolated fructose. It is fructose embedded in a complex biological matrix of fiber, polyphenols, antioxidants, vitamins, and water. This matrix fundamentally changes how the fructose behaves inside the body. The fiber slows absorption. The polyphenols interact with gut bacteria in ways that improve insulin sensitivity. The antioxidants reduce the oxidative stress that drives diabetic complications. Eating whole fruit and drinking fruit juice are, from a metabolic standpoint, almost entirely different experiences. Yet, most dietary advice treats them identically. A 2013 study published in the British Medical Journal, drawing on data from 3 large prospective cohort studies involving over 180,000 participants, found that consumption of whole fruit was associated with a significantly lower risk of type 2 diabetes, while fruit juice consumption was associated with a higher risk. The same sugars, completely different outcomes. Because the matrix matters. A 2021 systematic review published in Nutrients, analyzing 23 randomized controlled trials, concluded that whole fruit consumption does not impair glycemic control in individuals with type 2 diabetes, and in fact may offer meaningful improvements in fasting glucose and A1C when specific fruits are chosen. That review existed before most of the patients sitting in diabetes clinics today were told to stop eating fruit. It simply never reached the conversation. With that context established, it is time to begin, starting at number 3. Number 3 is the fruit that most people managing diabetes have been most aggressively warned away from, And that warning, it turns out, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how this fruit behaves inside a diabetic body. Bananas. Not unripe, green bananas eaten in the way a person might eat a salad, but ordinary bananas, consumed at the right ripeness level and with the right companion foods, that deliver something to the body that most diabetes medications are designed to approximate, but can never quite replicate. The confusion about bananas begins with their glycemic index score. A ripe banana scores between 51 and 60 on the glycemic index, not low, but not high either, falling squarely in the moderate range. Many foods that diabetes patients are encouraged to eat daily score similarly or higher. The misrepresentation comes from treating glycemic index as the only relevant variable when evaluating a food's effect on blood sugar, which is a simplification that research abandoned over a decade ago. Glycemic load, which accounts for actual portion size, and the presence of resistant starch, pectin, and specific bioactive compounds in the banana flesh itself tell a far more complete story. A slightly underripe banana, still yellow but without the brown spotting of full ripeness, contains significantly higher levels of resistant starch than a fully ripe one. Resistant starch, as has been established in the research on meal preparation, is a form of carbohydrate that the small intestine cannot digest. It passes into the large intestine intact, where it is fermented by beneficial bacteria into short-chain fatty acids. These short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate and propionate, stimulate the release of GLP-1 from intestinal L cells, improve insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue, and reduce hepatic glucose production. A 2019 study published in the journal Nutrients, conducted by researchers at the University of Surrey in the United Kingdom, found that resistant starch from banana flour significantly reduced postprandial glucose response in adults with impaired glucose tolerance compared to a matched carbohydrate load from refined starch. But the resistant starch story is only part of what makes bananas valuable for diabetics. Bananas are one of the richest dietary sources of pectin, a soluble fiber that forms a viscous gel in the gastrointestinal tract and creates a physical barrier between the digestive enzymes and the carbohydrates passing through the intestine. This gel slows glucose absorption in a manner almost identical to the mechanism of acarbose, the prescription alpha-glucosidase inhibitor. A 2015 study in the Journal of Functional Foods found that pectin extracted from unripe banana significantly inhibited alpha-glucosidase activity in vitro, with an inhibition profile comparable to pharmaceutical compounds at equivalent concentrations. Beyond fiber and resistant starch, bananas contain a compound called chlorogenic acid, a polyphenol belonging to the same family responsible for much of coffee's beneficial metabolic effects. Chlorogenic acid has been shown in multiple studies to inhibit glucose 6-phosphatase, an enzyme involved in hepatic glucose production. By reducing the liver's output of glucose between meals, chlorogenic acid addresses one of the central metabolic dysfunctions of type 2 diabetes, the liver continuing to release glucose into the bloodstream even when blood sugar is already elevated. A 2020 study published in Phytotherapy Research found that chlorogenic acid supplementation reduced fasting glucose by an average of 8.6 milligrams per deciliter in adults with type 2 diabetes over 12 weeks, an improvement that, if achieved by a pharmaceutical compound, would be the subject of significant clinical interest. The practical protocol for bananas in a diabetic diet is specific. 1 medium banana, slightly underripe, consumed as part of a meal that includes protein and fat, not as a standalone snack. The protein and fat slow gastric emptying, reducing the rate at which glucose from the banana enters the bloodstream. Eating a banana alongside 2 eggs and a tablespoon of almond butter produces a fundamentally different postprandial glucose curve than eating that same banana alone on an empty stomach. The food, consumed correctly, is not the problem. The context of its consumption is everything. Consider the story of Dorothy, 67 years old, a retired pharmacist from Columbus, Ohio. Dorothy understood medications. She had spent 31 years dispensing them, explaining them, counseling patients on their side effects, When she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes at 63, she applied the same systematic approach to her diet that she had always applied to her professional work. She eliminated all fruit immediately, following the advice of both her endocrinologist and the printed dietary guidelines she had been handed. Her A1C improved modestly with medication, sitting at 7.2, but her energy was poor, her digestion had worsened considerably, and the joy she had always taken in food had disappeared almost entirely. A colleague who had read the British Medical Journal study on whole fruit and diabetes risk sent her the research. Dorothy spent a weekend reading the literature. She began reintroducing slightly underripe banana, one medium banana, with breakfast 3 times per week, always paired with eggs. After 14 weeks, her postprandial glucose readings after banana-inclusive breakfasts were lower than after her standard grain-based breakfast. Her A1C at her next quarterly check had moved to 6.9. Her endocrinologist attributed the improvement to the metformin dose adjustment made 6 months earlier. Dorothy knew the timeline did not support that explanation. If this is making someone angry, if the realization that a piece of fruit has been unnecessarily eliminated from the diet is landing as a frustration, that anger is appropriate. Drop a comment below saying, "I want the truth." Every comment tells the algorithm that this content matters to real people, and every comment helps this information reach another senior who has been told the same incomplete story. Hit like if this channel is doing what a physician's appointment should be doing. Hit subscribe if the complete picture is worth having. Moving to number 2, and this one will surprise almost no one who has spent any time researching natural blood sugar management. But the depth of the mechanism, the specific compounds involved, and the sheer volume of clinical evidence behind this fruit are almost never discussed in the superficial coverage it typically receives online. Blueberries, but not as a vague wellness recommendation. As a precisely understood therapeutic food with specific biological targets that overlap substantially with some of the most expensive pharmaceutical interventions currently prescribed for diabetic complications. Blueberries contain one of the highest concentrations of anthocyanins found in any commonly available food. Anthocyanins are water-soluble pigments belonging to the flavonoid family, the compounds responsible for the deep blue and purple coloration of the fruit. They are not incidental to the blueberry's nutritional profile. They are, according to a substantial and growing body of research, the primary mechanism through which blueberry consumption produces its metabolic effects. The most foundational of these effects is the improvement of insulin sensitivity. A landmark randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial published in the Journal of Nutrition in 2010, conducted by researchers at Louisiana State University's Pennington Biomedical Research Center, assigned obese, insulin-resistant adults to consume either a smoothie containing 45 grams of blueberry powder, equivalent to approximately 2 cups of fresh blueberries, or a matched placebo smoothie daily for 6 weeks. At the end of the trial, the blueberry group showed a 22% improvement in insulin sensitivity compared to the placebo group. 22% from a food in 6 weeks, without medication change, without exercise protocol, without caloric restriction. The authors noted in their discussion that this magnitude of improvement in insulin sensitivity is comparable to what is typically achieved with low-dose thiazolidinedione medications, a class of insulin sensitizers that carries significant side effects, including fluid retention, weight gain, and increased fracture risk in older adults. The mechanism behind this insulin sensitizing effect operates at the level of gene expression. Anthocyanins activate a cellular signaling pathway called AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, which functions as the body's master metabolic regulator. When AMPK is activated, it simultaneously increases glucose uptake in muscle cells, reduces glucose production in the liver, and improves mitochondrial function throughout the body. AMPK activation is the same pathway targeted by metformin, the most widely prescribed diabetes medication in the world. Blueberry anthocyanins activate this pathway through a different molecular mechanism than metformin, meaning that for patients already taking metformin, blueberry consumption may provide complementary rather than redundant benefit. Beyond insulin sensitivity, blueberries demonstrate a specific protective effect on the vascular complications that cause the most devastating long-term damage in diabetic patients. Diabetic retinopathy, damage to the small blood vessels supplying the retina, is the leading cause of blindness in working-age adults in the United States. Diabetic nephropathy, kidney damage driven by the same mechanism of small vessel destruction, affects approximately 40% of people with type 2 diabetes over their lifetime. Both conditions are driven by endothelial dysfunction, the breakdown of the cells lining blood vessel walls under the sustained oxidative stress of chronic hyperglycemia. Anthocyanins from blueberries have been shown in multiple cell and animal studies, and in a growing number of human trials, to protect endothelial cells from oxidative damage through several complementary pathways. They increase nitric oxide production in the endothelium, improving vasodilation and blood flow to vulnerable tissues, including the retina and kidney glomeruli. They inhibit the formation of advanced glycation end products, the sticky molecular byproducts of excess glucose that accumulate in blood vessel walls and drive the inflammatory cascade responsible for diabetic vascular damage. A 2019 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, following 621 participants over a median of 7 years, found that higher habitual intake of anthocyanin-rich foods, with blueberries as the primary contributor, was associated with a 28% lower risk of type 2 diabetes and a significantly lower incidence of cardiovascular events in those already diagnosed. The protocol for blueberries is straightforward. Half a cup to 1 cup of fresh or frozen blueberries daily. Frozen blueberries retain their anthocyanin content as effectively as fresh, making them a practical and affordable option in all seasons. Consumed as part of a meal containing protein and fat, or as a standalone snack in the mid-afternoon window when insulin sensitivity remains adequate. The single most important principle is consistency. The research showing meaningful improvements in A1C and insulin sensitivity reflects daily consumption over weeks and months, not occasional use. Margaret was 71, a retired teacher from Portland, Maine, who had managed type 2 diabetes for 8 years. Her primary concern was not her glucose readings, which had stabilized adequately on her current medication regimen. Her concern was her eyes. She had been told 2 years earlier that she had early non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy, small areas of microaneurysm in the retinal vasculature, and that the appropriate response was to monitor and return in 6 months. She had been told this at every appointment since. Monitor. Return. Nothing to do. She discovered the research on anthocyanins and retinal vascular protection through a support group for people with diabetic eye disease. She began eating 1 cup of blueberries daily, every morning, without exception, mixed into her Greek yogurt. She maintained this for 14 months before her next ophthalmology examination. Her retinal specialist noted that the microaneurysm count had not progressed, which, she was told, was unusual for someone at her stage of retinopathy over a 14-month period. The specialist said, "Whatever you are doing, keep doing it." Margaret asked whether the blueberries could have contributed. The specialist said the research on anthocyanins and retinal vascular health was promising, but not yet incorporated into clinical guidelines. Margaret asked when it would be incorporated into clinical guidelines. The specialist did not have an answer. There are thousands of Margarets. Thousands of people sitting in waiting rooms, receiving monitoring appointments, being told to come back in 6 months while a 30-cent daily serving of blueberries sits unprescribed in the produce section of every grocery store in the country. If this channel is reaching someone who needed to hear Margaret's story, please share this video with every senior managing diabetes or pre-diabetes that is known to you. A spouse, a neighbor, a member of a church group. The algorithm will not deliver this to them without that action. The share takes 10 seconds. The impact lasts years. Now to number 1, the fruit that research consistently places above all others for blood sugar management in diabetic adults, that produces measurable improvements in A1C, fasting glucose, postprandial glucose, insulin resistance, inflammatory markers, and cardiovascular risk simultaneously, and that most physicians have never mentioned to a single diabetic patient in the context of glycemic management. Berberine has received enormous attention in recent years as a natural compound that rivals metformin in its metabolic effects. The fruit about to be discussed contains compounds that operate through 3 of the same pathways as berberine, at a cost of approximately 60 cents per serving. The fruit is avocado. And before the objection arises that avocado is technically a fruit, it is. Botanically, unambiguously, a fruit. And its effects on blood sugar regulation in diabetic adults over 60 are documented in a volume of peer-reviewed literature that should have made it a standard recommendation in every endocrinologist's office years ago. The primary mechanisms through which avocado acts on blood sugar regulation are 3 in number, and each warrants detailed examination because each is operating on a different aspect of the diabetic metabolic dysfunction. The first mechanism is the modulation of postprandial glucose through fat-mediated slowing of gastric emptying. Avocado is extraordinarily rich in monounsaturated fatty acids, primarily oleic acid, the same fat found in olive oil that has been studied extensively for its anti-inflammatory and insulin-sensitizing properties. When consumed as part of a carbohydrate-containing meal, the monounsaturated fat in avocado slows the rate at which the stomach empties its contents into the small intestine. This delayed gastric emptying, the same mechanism exploited by GLP-1 receptor agonists like Ozempic, spreads glucose absorption over a longer period, flattening the postprandial glucose curve. A 2019 randomized crossover trial published in Nutrients, conducted by researchers at Loma Linda University in California, found that adding half an avocado to a standard carbohydrate-containing lunch reduced postprandial insulin levels by 40% and improved postprandial glucose area under the curve by 18% compared to the identical meal without avocado. The second mechanism is the fiber-mediated improvement in gut microbiome composition. Avocado contains 7 grams of fiber per half fruit, a combination of both soluble and insoluble fiber in a ratio that research has identified as particularly beneficial for gut microbiome diversity. A 2021 randomized controlled trial, published in the Journal of Nutrition, conducted by researchers at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, assigned 163 overweight adults to consume either 1 avocado daily or a matched caloric control meal for 12 weeks. At the end of the trial, the avocado group showed significantly greater gut microbiome diversity, specifically an increase in Faecalibacterium prausnitzii and Lachnospiraceae, bacteria species strongly associated with improved insulin sensitivity and reduced systemic inflammation. Faecalibacterium prausnitzii is one of the most abundant bacteria in the healthy human gut and one of the first species depleted in type 2 diabetes. The avocado group also showed significantly lower fecal bile acid concentrations, a marker indicating that the fiber was binding and removing secondary bile acids that contribute to intestinal inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. The third mechanism is the most remarkable because it operates at the level of mitochondrial function, the very cellular machinery that determines how efficiently the body converts glucose into energy rather than allowing it to accumulate in the bloodstream. Avocados contain a unique bioactive compound called avocatin B, a lipid found almost exclusively in avocado. Avocatin B was identified and characterized by researchers at the University of Guelph in Canada, with findings published in the journal Cancer Research in 2015 and subsequently explored for metabolic applications in a 2019 study published in the journal Molecular Nutrition and Food Research. Avocatin B inhibits an enzyme called fatty acid oxidation in pancreatic cells in a way that paradoxically improves their function, reducing the toxic accumulation of incomplete fatty acid breakdown products that impair beta cell insulin secretion in type 2 diabetes. The Guelph researchers found that avocatin B improved insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue and reduced fasting glucose in mouse models of type 2 diabetes by 33%, with human trial research ongoing as of the time of publication. The combination of these 3 mechanisms, postprandial glucose flattening through delayed gastric emptying, gut microbiome improvement through prebiotic fiber, and mitochondrial support through avocatin B, makes avocado unique among foods studied for blood sugar management. No other single food has been shown to operate on all three of these pathways simultaneously, and yet it remains entirely absent from standard dietary counseling in diabetes care because there is no pharmaceutical equivalent to avocado, no patent to protect, no monthly revenue model to sustain. The practical protocol is simple. Half a medium avocado consumed once daily, at lunch or dinner, added to any carbohydrate-containing meal. Not as a side dish consumed after the carbohydrates, sequenced early in the meal as part of the vegetable and fat course that precedes the starchy portion to maximize the gastric emptying effect. Sliced onto eggs in the morning, mashed with lemon onto a salad at lunch, or eaten alongside protein at dinner. Consistent daily use is the critical variable. The gut microbiome changes observed in the University of Illinois trial required 12 weeks of consistent daily consumption to reach statistical significance. Consider the story of Vincent, 69 years old, a retired high school principal from Phoenix, Arizona. Vincent had been managing prediabetes for 4 years, maintaining a fasting glucose between 115 and 135 with diet and exercise alone, resisting his physician's repeated suggestions to begin metformin. He was exercising daily, had eliminated processed food from his diet almost entirely, and was eating what he believed to be an exemplary diet for a pre-diabetic. His fasting glucose continued to drift upward. He added half an avocado to his lunch daily, an addition that required no sacrifice, no discipline, no special preparation. He made no other dietary change. After 16 weeks, his fasting glucose had dropped to 108, the lowest it had been in 3 years. His physician reviewed the readings and recommended he continue whatever he was doing. When Vincent explained the avocado, the physician nodded politely and said, "Diet certainly plays a role." It was not the response Vincent felt the data deserved. But the data was real, and so was the reading of 108. Here is the complete daily protocol that brings all three of these fruits together into a coherent daily practice. In the morning, build breakfast around protein, eggs, Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, and add half a cup of blueberries to the meal, consuming them alongside or immediately after the protein. The blueberries paired with protein produce a significantly lower postprandial response than blueberries eaten alone. At lunch, include half an avocado sequenced early in the meal, eaten before the starchy component of the lunch, allowing the monounsaturated fat to begin slowing gastric emptying before the glucose load arrives. 3 times per week, include a slightly underripe banana as part of breakfast or a mid-morning snack, always paired with a protein source. 2 tablespoons of almond butter, a hard-boiled egg, a small serving of Greek yogurt. Maintain this consistency for a minimum of 8 weeks before evaluating results. The research that demonstrates meaningful A1C improvement reflects consistent daily use over 8 to 12 weeks, not occasional inclusion. None of this replaces existing medication. Any change to a medication regimen must be discussed with a physician who has reviewed the blood sugar improvements that these dietary additions produce. What these 3 fruits represent is not an alternative to medical care. They represent the piece of medical care that has been systematically omitted from the conversation, the part where a physician explains that what is eaten and what specific compounds those foods contain, and how those compounds interact with the precise biological dysfunctions of type 2 diabetes, matters as much as the medication prescribed to address those same dysfunctions. The pharmaceutical industry does not fund research on blueberries. It does not sponsor continuing medical education seminars on avocado. It does not produce the pamphlets distributed in diabetes clinic waiting rooms describing the AMPK activating properties of anthocyanins or the gut microbiome benefits of avocatin B. It funds research on compounds it can patent and distribute at a profit. The absence of fruit from the standard diabetes conversation is not an accident. It is the predictable outcome of a system in which the entity with the most resources to educate physicians is the entity with the least incentive to recommend a 60-cent serving of avocado as a daily therapeutic intervention.